In this video, we're going to talk about goals and objectives. So just some things about goals and objectives that you need to be aware of. Goals are big. They're very broad. They're like an umbrella that covers over quite a lot of your standards. A goal would be something that you're going to spend 2, 3, 4 weeks on. A goal is not something that just matches with one standard. A goal is very big with lots of standards. Objectives, on the other hand, are very small. One standard might have several objectives underneath it. So objectives have three possibilities. The first one is affective, which means that you're going to talk about you want your students to gain an appreciation for, or you want them to enjoy something. Those kind of objectives are very difficult to measure. You can't necessarily ask a question about someone's appreciation of something, for example. Cognitive objectives are the ones that you're probably most familiar with. They tie directly to the standards. They reflect the skills and concepts that you want your students to be able to do. You want your students to be able to understand things that they're going to be able to say at the end of the day, I can do this, 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 and this. And the last kind is psychomotor. These are things students can actually physically do. Now, sometimes people get this a little bit mixed up, and when they have students graphing, they want to say that's a psychomotor objective, or when they have students writing out steps. But that's not really what this is about. Psychomotor is more along the lines of something you want to do with a construction, or something you want to build a cylinder or something like that. It's a little bit more than just putting a dot on a grid. Okay, so let's look at one standard from each grade level, if the video lasts that long, and we're going to talk about your goals and objectives activities that you're going to turn in for me, but also kind of how you're going to think about this as a classroom teacher. So here's a sixth grade standard, data analysis and statistics. The first thing you have to identify for yourself is, what do my students already know about this? You can give pre-tests, but before you even get to that point, you need to know what to put on the pretest. You're going to have to look back in the other standards and see, okay, what do my students already know that relates to this that I can put on a pretest, for example? Well, in sixth grade, turns out that prior knowledge of data and statistics is non-existent. With our old standards, the students did some things in this category starting in early elementary school. That is no longer true. With the new standards, the Common Core standards, data and statistics doesn't come in at all until sixth grade. So they have no prior knowledge. So you just want to make a little statement. My students don't have any prior knowledge of this. This is the first time they've seen this topic, or something like that. Okay, so let's talk about goals. Again, your goal is big. Your goal can fit quite a lot of standards underneath it. So you're going to want to go to that standards document. These are the South Carolina standards for data analysis and statistics for sixth grade. And I want a goal that's going to be able to put all of this inside of it. It's not going to be sufficient for me just to look at that first standard for my goal. I need to look at the standards as a group, because I'm going to spend several weeks talking about this goal. And so I need to have quite a lot in there that'll fit underneath it. So I read through this set of 5 standards, and I kind of try to get the flavor for what the standards are about. So what I came up with, my goal, how can statistics be used to make sense of the world around me? And you can see that everything in this list goes back to the idea of using statistics on data, and that data is going to be real world data. So I'm using statistics to identify information about that data. I now know that most people do this, or very few people do that. I'm making sense of what's happening in the world around me using some statistical abilities that I'm gaining as a sixth grader. Okay, so now let's talk about objectives. Objectives are those very small things. Objectives are going to be tied directly to the standard that you chose. For my purposes and my goals and objectives assignments, I'm asking you to write always only 2 objectives. In order to fully get this standard completed, you might have to write more than 2 objectives. So your objectives may not cover the entirety of this standard, and that's okay. I just want 2 objectives that tie directly to this standard. So the first one I came up with, identify a statistical question. I can't differentiate between them if I don't even know what one is. And that is a cognitive standard, so I'm going to, a cognitive objective rather, so I'm going to list that out there because I'm asking the students to learn something, to be able to demonstrate something. And then my second objective is to write a statistical question. It's not sufficient just to be able to say this one is, this one isn't. In order to go a little bit deeper into Bloom's taxonomy, I want you to create one of your own. I want you to write one for me. But again, that's still cognitive. So when you do your goals and objectives activity, this is an example of what you might turn in for one of your standards. Okay, let's look at something from 7th grade. All right, so I went to the ratio and proportional relationships content band and I picked one of the specific standards there. And now let's talk about some prior knowledge. Okay, so let's look back and see what we know. Okay, so here's what we've got from 6th grade. Students have already done some work now with ratios and proportions, so we can no longer say we don't know anything. The standard that I have chosen, you can see there is the third one. So I could look at those first two. Probably we covered those before the third one, so I can get some ideas there. But also think about, like, as your students are doing ratios and proportions, what are some skills that they need? The ratio and proportional relationship content band doesn't show up until 6th grade, but there are some ideas behind that that they need. For example, by the time they got to 5th grade, they were able to fluently multiply and divide. In order to work well with ratios and proportions, you have to be able to multiply and divide. So if you were going to make a pretest, this is something you might want to put on it. What skills did my students bring with them from elementary school? What do they remember and what do they not? All right, so that's what I chose for my prior knowledge. I picked some 6th grade standards and some 5th grade standards. Notice that I listed out the standard number and I also made a sentence about what the students know. So from those 6th grade standards, students have already learned what a ratio is and they know how to work with one to some extent. Obviously, 6th grade was their introduction, so they're not perfect at it, but they have at least been introduced to it, and that is something that they have in their toolbox. From 5th grade, students should know how to multiply and divide. They worked on multiplication and division from 3rd grade to 5th grade. So hopefully by the time they get to you in 7th grade, that's a skill they're good at, but maybe not. Maybe that's something you're going to have to go back and practice for warm-ups or whatever. Okay, so now let's talk about goals. I'm going to go back up here to the 7th grade standards, and you can see that as I'm looking at these with rates, I'm looking at a variety of things that I want them to do, a variety of things I want them to understand, and I want all of these things to be able to be covered by my one goal. My goal is not going to be small and attached to just this particular standard. My goal is for this set of standards as a whole. So I've got the first two standards there, and then the third one was on our page that we were looking at. So there's my goal. I want to use ratios and proportions to solve problems in the real world. The ratio and proportion section is very real world applicable. They do a lot of things there that a person just in general needs to know how to do to live life. So that goal is tied to the way this is going to be used in their life once they're beyond 7th grade. They're still actually going to have to do percent increase and decrease. They're still going to have to do tax. These are just important things for people to be able to do. Okay, so let's talk about our objectives. Again, your objectives are tied directly to that particular standard. The two that I chose use dimensional analysis to translate from one unit to another. You can see that where it says EG, that's the first thing there. And then I picked the third one, calculate the amount of tax on a purchase. So that second one I just skipped over completely, not because I'm not going to do it in my class as a 7th grade teacher, but because for purposes of this particular assignment, all I'm asking you to do is 2 objectives. So if your 2 objectives do not cover the whole standard, that is not a problem. All right, let's look at 8th grade. So 8th grade, we went to geometry, and I'm picking the second standard, and that particular standard happens to have several subpoints. I picked the 4th of the subpoints, and we're going to be looking at transformations. Okay, so again, I'm going to go backwards and see what I can find. Well, I look at the 7th grade geometry standards, I don't really see a whole lot there about transformations. It's just not really something that they do in 7th grade. So does that mean they have no ability in this, or is there something else I can possibly tie to it? Well, if I go back to 6th grade, they have already learned how to graph. And most of the things, I'm going to go back up to the standard, most of the things for this particular standard, when you're transforming an image and a pre-image, you're generally doing that on a piece of graph paper. So I'm going to choose for my prior knowledge the fact that they do already know how to graph. And as I pointed out, this particular standard is the second one, and it's the fourth one down in that second one. So I did pick up a geometry standard from earlier in 8th grade. So maybe I introduced them to transformations last week, but that is technically prior knowledge because that's not what I'm doing today. Today, I'm looking at this one. Okay, so goals. Okay, stop and think. Where do I look to find my goal? Is it sufficient just to look at this standard? Nope, I need to look at the standards as a whole. So 8th grade actually has quite a few geometry standards, but they seem to kind of split into two categories. They have this category of transformations, and then they have another category that has more to do with shapes and area and volume and that sort of thing. So I just lumped together all of the standards that seem to fit together, which was this transformation idea. Maybe I'm going to spend 2 or 3 weeks working on transformations, and that's going to be one unit. And then I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to do a totally different unit on those shapes and area and volume and that sort of thing. So when I look at my goal, I only need to look at these first 4 standards. I don't need to look at those other ones because they're fairly unrelated to these 4. Okay, so I'm going to look at these 4 as a whole. And there's the goal that I came up with. For my class, we are going to learn how to do these transformations. And at the end of my unit, we're going to do a project. It's going to be an art project. The kids are going to love it. It's going to be so cool. And so we're going to focus on mathematical art is my goal. Okay, so now let's do our objectives. Our objectives are tied to this particular standard. So I'm going to now focus in very narrowly just on that standard. And here's the 2 objectives that I came up with. So I noticed that it said they are only congruent if. Well, if my students don't understand what congruent is, then they cannot do that part of the standard. So the first thing that I need to have as an objective is for them to be able to identify this is congruent and this is not congruent. And then I want them to be able to use transformations to map a pre-image onto an image. That doesn't meet the rest of this standard. Notice in this standard, I'm talking about recognition of congruence with the transformations. So in my objectives, all I've done is congruence by itself and transformation by itself. For real, as an 8th grade teacher, I would need more objectives to put those things together. But for purposes of turning in this assignment, I'm asking you to do 2 objectives, and I have done those 2 objectives.